So I don't know if we can look back and laugh at now, but some of the five-line phone-ins Linda did with the anti-maskers and then the anti-vaxxers were quite legendary. So if you ever bored late at night and you're scrolling through the 5 archives, now is the time that we can look back happily and reflect on them, I think. So now we'd like to invite every panelist for the session to take the stage, if we may. The format that we'd like to propose would be that if the panelists wanted to say a few words about maybe themselves or their reflections on the theme of demography in action and how they feel about this kind of broad agenda of work we've done, that would be great. And so first, perhaps I'll welcome James. So James is the former Director of Data at the FCO. He was formerly the Director of Europe, Latin America as well. Very innovative in terms of technology policy and all things related to this. An OBE, if I'm not mistaken. And so, James, if you wouldn't mind giving a few words on your information.
And I'm now the director of the Digitally Foundation, which is about 11 miles from Oxford. Digitally is a 60-year-old convening organisation dedicated to strengthening democratic societies, states, and alliances. And we do that by approaching a broad range of issues that we think are interconnected across the challenges of democracies and societies, which demography absolutely fits. We held a conference on demography, which Melinda and Bill both attended. Bill chaired it brilliantly, lost where Bill is, but that was, there you are, Bill. Thank you again for that. That was great. And since that conference, I see sort of demography in all of our problems. Geopolitics, hard defense, the rise of disruptive technologies, and the difficulty of climate policy, which is going to become clearer as we get into the real work rather than the target-setting work that we've been able to do to date. I thought I would talk, I mean, this panel was framed a little bit around demographic science in action. I think I have to, as a non-scientist, talk about demography in action in the world, or demographic effects. And what I wanted to do, and I won't be presenting any data, and this is not scientific, and I know that, what I wanted to do was to extend the conversation into geopolitics and to look at what I think are interesting demographic trends that are shaping geopolitics, alongside other things, but really, to me at least, clearly there at the bottom, the bottom glacial level, pushing things forward. And I want to use three different geographic focuses or case studies to make some basic points. Russia and Ukraine, China and the Indo-Pacific, and then to come back closer to home and a bit closer to some of the issues we've been talking about this morning on Europe and Africa and the Middle East and how they're going to interact in a demographic way. Thankfully, I think Bill has covered all the economic issues brilliantly and lucidly, and I wasn't going to, so hopefully there won't be too much overlap. But let's talk about Russia and China. And just put simply, Russia's demographics, as I'm sure most of you know, are terrible. People are leaving, the economy has shrunk a lot, health is still a big issue, there are many, many prizes to try and have more to natalist policies, but nonetheless, Russia is shrinking gradually as a country. And the Ukraine war, as it has played out, has made that much, much worse. 1 million Russians have left, others still want to get out, and a lot of people have been killed, particularly people who might have had families. So that's how it's turned out. If you think how it was intended, it's very, very different. The Russians who crossed the border on the first day of the invasion had 3 days' rations, and they were carrying their dress uniforms for the victory parade in Ukraine. It was meant to be and intended to be a walk in the park, and most people thought it would be. Though it wasn't is down to the sharing of some intelligence, but fundamentally the bravery of Vladimir Zelensky and Ukrainians collectively, which turned it into, at least the first stage of the war, a nightmare. So if you think about how it was intended, one way of interpreting this is that it's a big demographic play. What do you get from Ukraine if you take over Ukraine as Vladimir Putin? You get people who may not like it, some of them actually would welcome it, that are easily convertible to being Russians in the image, the historical image that Vladimir Putin was trying to create. a large number of them, a large number of them. And you saw that sort of thinking follow through in policies where they were taking, even as it played out, they were taking children into Russia to essentially carry out conversion camps and produce new Russians. Russians that would come with land and with a lot of natural resources, and that would transform the kind of position of Russia in the short term, and what that would look like. And the aim really was inclusion rather than, it's a close imperial ambition, where you're trying to bring people into the motherland, rather than a distant imperial ambition, where you're collecting colonies, and it has a sort of different nature. But I think that demography was a part of what led to this conflict, and I think it's interesting to look at other conflicts in that light. If we look at China, China, as you all know as demographers, has had for years a one-child policy, which it is finding it impossible to reverse. It's just not making traction, despite all of its tools, all of its influence. And therefore, if you look at China's demographic future, it's kind of clear. Well, how is that going to work out? I think you can look at some of the policies in China and say the first thing is they don't want to lose anyone who could possibly be Chinese. So they want to try and maintain as cohesive a society as they can, and that includes the kind of really harsh policies on separatist political identities, the 9 poisons. So you try and keep what you've got. You try and integrate when you can, hence Hong Kong. Also makes kind of demographic sense in trying to bring people in. And then, of course, you've got Taiwan. It is unfinished business for the Communist Party. There's lots of other reasons for this move, but it also makes sense in terms of trying to keep China as large as possible as you go into the future. China's competitor for world power is the United States, which, although it is suffering some aging, actually still has a culture, and we'll see what happens if President Trump wins, but at the moment still has a culture which essentially celebrates legal migration and a culture of assimilation which remains very, very strong, although the illegal migration is becoming an issue there. So I think we will see how this kind of plays out in China. If you look at the timelines China has set, that Taiwan must be solved for future generations. We must be ahead in these areas of technology by this date. Those match pretty well with a sense of demographic decline. And the technology one is interesting because if you don't have the numbers, what can you do to sustain power? You can improve productivity per capita through the application of technology, through leadership in disruptive technologies. And so those things can be seen through a demographic lens. If I come back closer to home, Europe and Africa and the Middle East, then in many European countries, practically all industrialized countries, and we were talking at the break even about Scandinavia, which has just exemplary approaches to childcare, kindergartens, family-friendly policies, it's not working. It's not working. In all industrialized countries, as you know much better than me, the birth rate is dropping, and dropping really significantly. Anecdotally, I went back to Siena in Italy for the first time in 6 years. When I last went to Siena on a family holiday, simple as that, in 2019, everyone was Italian. If there were foreign workers, you didn't see them. This time, you could pretty much spend a day in Siena, and if you chose the wrong restaurants, not meet an Italian, let alone a Sienese. It's just lack of people as that's going through. And that's got a huge challenge in Europe. It obviously has economic effects that Bill was touching on. It also has political effects. People, as they age, get more conservative. There's more focus on keeping what you've got because the time to replace it is shorter or more limited. And you can see that played out in places like Bulgaria, where politics is the way it is because young people have left. If you look south, then there is a challenge and an answer. Obviously, in Africa, population is still growing, although many African countries see those rates drop really rapidly with urbanization, as I understand it. So that trend may level off, but the population is growing. In Africa, though, you've also got climate change. And if you look at the agricultural impact of climate change on Africa, it's what you'd expect. It's a kind of extension of the Sahara. Desertification of the middle of the country to match what has happened in the north. If you just remember the shape of Africa, South Africa is already full of Zimbabweans going south. The natural shape means resources are tighter where the people go. And so you've got, there's one answer. You've got to get across the Sahara, but the smuggling industry is continuing to grow. And that will drive people forward, as we all would do when faced with these appalling choices. And then you've got sort of the Middle East, which just looks set for interminable conflict, now worse than ever. And I spent 16 years working in the Middle East in the earlier part of my career. So those people are going to be driven by need, by natural forces to migrate. Europe needs people, and that's where demography hits culture and history, and hits the politics that you're seeing starting to play out now. As Bill said, if Europe is growing fast, it's not so difficult. Europe has lost 25% in terms of economic power vis-a-vis the United States since 2008. That trend continues. So it's not a growing pie. It's relatively, in terms of world GDP, a shrinking pie, and it's going to need to be spread amongst more people. And if you then look at come back to sort of more domestic politics, you've got Alternative for Deutschland, essentially at its edges a fascist party in Germany, polling higher than all the other parties put together in Saxony and in some of the other Eastern European states. And we've seen what's happened in France, and that sort of worry about displacement, which is deep in the French psyche as we go forward. So my sort of suggestion is that demography clearly has its place in social policy and economic policy. Demography is going to be increasingly important in how geopolitics plays out in the years ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. I invite Professor Danny Dorling to the stage. So I actually first met Danny on Newsnight when I was watching in 2012, and I thought he's speaking so wisely and so eloquently, Professor of Human Geography, he's speaking so eloquently about some issues with regards to inequality and poverty in the UK. And I thought, one day it might be an honour and privilege to meet him, so I'm delighted to welcome him to the stage. Danny, if you wanted to give some of your reflections on your experience of demography in action, your research, or the presentations otherwise, please.
Yeah, and I'll keep it short because we've 14 minutes for lunch. I know you'll come to me. So I'm going to do you proud, don't worry. You're speaking? Yeah. No. Be ready. I'm a geographer, which means an expert at nothing. I went to Newcastle University from here to learn demography, but the professor who's taught demography decided to take his single sabbatical year in his entire career in the second year when I was a study under him, Tony Champion. Lovely man, told me later. I did maths and geography and computing and a PhD on visualization in 1989. In 1989, I have to mention that's on here, there used to be 2 Rhodes houses. The second Rhodes house was one of the sports groups of Cheney School, a mile that way. And in 1989, the children at Cheney School refused to run for Rhodes, and it was renamed Martin Luther King House. Right? Things do change. The University of Oxford changes slower, children are more quick and clever. I'm not going to tell you about my work, I'm just going to tell you about one idea, which I do not have time or the ability to explore, but I'm increasingly convinced it's an interesting idea, and you're the right set of people in 2 minutes to tell about it, because one of you might look into it. I've been involved in genome-wide research, looking at ability with colleagues in Bristol. I've done lots of work on schools and how people do. And there's a failing belief that you can get a set of polygenetic scores which predict intelligence. Academic researchers tend to love this because they think they're clever. Sometimes they even measure themselves and find they've got this set of scores and go, oh look, I'm really clever, I deserve to be here. It helps with the imposter syndrome. So there was a paper with 10 authors but one of which was Toby Young a few years ago. You know, Toby's the son of Michael, who wrote the 1945 Labour Manifesto. Toby's somewhat different to Michael. And that paper was trying to prove this. It was controversial, because I think Michael Gove was Secretary of State for Health, for Education at the time. One of his bads is on the supplementary material, but not on the main paper. But highly influential about ability, inherited genetic ability. And earlier, I should say, fascinated about COVID in the schools, and we know about the closing of schools and who that affects, and the arguments that were in Sage. Your work about the bias. I am in Biobank. When I went to Sheffield, I thought anyway. Let's go back to it. I've got you on tenterhooks. You want to know what is the great idea. If this is true, by the way, you don't have to reference me at all. All the rest of you can pretend that you weren't here, right? It's in an obscure book chapter and a couple of papers I've written. Nobody will ever know it's yours. Nobel Prize winning idea. Don't credit Toby Young. These scores for intelligence are found to be just as high in the UK amongst children going to independent private schools as they are amongst children going to selective state grammar schools. Now, to go to a selective state grammar school, you have to pass the test at age 11. But to go to a private school, your parents have to have money. Some are selective, but there are lots and lots of private schools which are not at all. In fact, the school, if you've got cash, they will take you. So what on earth is going on when these complicated and very wide-ranging set of genes supposedly associated with intelligence are found just as commonly amongst young people who clearly are not that good at passing tests as amongst those who are good at passing tests, but are not found that commonly in the bulk of the population who went to schools like the school I went to. Now here's my suggestion. The genetic traits for intelligence are not genetic traits for intelligence. It doesn't make sense for human beings to have a variation in our ability to be clever. It doesn't make sense to have a set of people who are destined to be slaves and others who are destined to be rulers. Just as it doesn't make sense to have genes so that you don't have an opposable thumb, or genes that mean your vision is not binocular. It doesn't make genetic sense to have a weakness that carries on. It does make genetic sense to have a propensity of some people to get fat than others. This is my favourite genetic finding from the Bristol work. You could put me in a prison cell and slide a slice of lettuce a day, and I would become thin and beautiful. But as it is, it's not just my greed and my lack of self-control and my obvious left-wing leanings that lead to the size I am. I have the genes that make me fatter. Some of you don't. But some of you may be starving yourselves to be the shapes you are, but it's mostly just in you. Why do we have a genetic variation in propensity to be fat? Because in times when the food runs out, I'm afraid I'm going to survive, and you beautiful thin people are going to have it. But generally, you beautiful thin people are going to live longer. Okay? It's a genetic variation that makes sense. So what are the genes for cleverness? I'm not blaming anybody for having these genes. Don't blame me. I may have some of them. I'm fairly narcissistic and egotistical, as you can tell. They're genes for greed. They're genes for being acquisitive, for getting stuff, for holding on, for not being feckless, if you want to use the politics of another side to me. Some people are greedier than others. I'm left-wing, so I'm going to use the word greedy. I should try and think of a nicer word. And those people who are greedy, of course, are going to amass more money because they look after it carefully and try and get it off others. And they will send their children to schools where they will get higher A-levels and marks. And their children and them will think that they're cleverer. I mean, it's very hard to not think you are if you're told you're clever all the time. The danger is that the clever, who are not actually clever, they're greedy, get concentrated together and then have a group think about how society should be and how we should deal with little people. And, you know, we know the right policies, but whatever you do, don't tell them what we're going to do, which is in their good, remember, because they're not as clever as us. Now, I've used up my time and I made sure that you've got because I'm inequality being left wing. But seriously, absolutely serious about it, I haven't got the time or the ability. But if you were to use the data from the genome-wide studies and to show that it does look likely that these things that we've associated with genes for cleverness, the ones that he was named earlier, Dominic, or Don to his mate, Don Cummings, the ones that Don thinks he has, are actually about being greedy. And then you can look at how different human societies at different times cope with greedy. What happens when you control the greedy, when you redistribute, when you're Nordic, or 15 European countries are as equal as Nordic countries? What happens when you let the greedy run wild? What happens to your country then? Understanding it is not people's fault that they are greedy, or not greedy, otherwise called pro-social. We'll all have tendencies to go one way or the other, but if you're fortunate and greedy, you're born in a more equal society. My favourite example are the members of the group ABBA, rather than being born in the United States. And when you make your hit records in the 1970s, you don't make so much money that you die early from your overuse of drugs, as most people did. But you stay in your equitable society, pay tax and live happily to an old age. So you might have been a bit grasping. You can see I really want somebody to look into this. It may not be true, but if it is true that the genes for intelligence are the genes for greed, and hence why so many of our high scores are going to the families of people who are greedy. I have a meeting this afternoon about the admissions against this university. We only let in 3 A's and above. If we wanted more people who weren't greedy, we might go below 3 A's. If we wanted more people who are clever, imaginative, different, smart, we would go beyond, below 3 A's. But are we clever enough to realise that? And if we wanted more people with my waistline, we probably wouldn't interview. Thank you very much.
Interesting perspective. Danny, I think you're an Oxford native as well, so it's very localised demography in action there as well. So we were going to have a panel with some questions, but I'd really like to invite Anna to come and give her reflections. Anna, of course, director of the Leverhulme Trust, and one of the main reasons why we're all here today. So Anna, if instead of us doing a round robin of questions, maybe you could spend the remainder of the time on the session just reflecting on demography in action and your perspectives, perhaps.
Yeah, so I'm probably speaking now with my previous hat on as well as an economist and an economist of education. And just a couple of reflections before I get into my remarks on your point, which is an interesting one. The overlap in socioeconomic background between those who attend grammar selective schools and private schools is pretty comprehensive. The likelihood of getting into a grammar school, selective school from anything other than a most privileged background is actually quite low. So separating those effects out is quite challenging. But I think you're absolutely right. The other thing that we might want to think about is the interaction between environment and genes. So if I have a tendency to put on weight but I'm in a calorie-controlled environment where I don't get the opportunity, obviously it never gets manifested. And you could also see that when it comes to genes around that might predict academic ability, then in certain environments your genes are irrelevant because you're not even getting into the environment and the opportunity to express those genes in that way. So I think it's a really interesting question, lots of things to think about. Anyway, I digress. I just wanted to make one comment which I think brings the two together, which is I was also, as Melinda said, involved in some of the modelling that went on during COVID, and indeed trying to, I was a co-author on the report on schools that happened in sort of March, April, May of 2020. And reflecting back on that experience, at one level it was quite transformative. It was genuinely interdisciplinary and of course incredibly important. But the interdisciplinarity came late. I think the government did actually start to write a report on schools with, I don't think there were even social scientists in the group, let alone educationalists or economists or all the other things. And indeed, when we were talking about writing a report about schools, it didn't seem obvious that my colleague, for example, Simon Burgess, who's an economist, should be in the room. But clearly, this is absolutely an economic, a social, and many other issues. And so I think one of the things that we can think about as demographers in the real world, I'm not one tend to be market led. One of the things we need to think about is how we're ready for the next crisis. How, as the speaker earlier alluded to, how we can take advantage of crises to put really good evidence in front of policymakers and make better decisions. And it comes to some of the things you were talking about. Demography, as an academic sense, is very good at identifying these drivers and painting the picture of what's to come. But obviously that's not enough, right? We want to use the science to actually make a difference and change things. And I think when we're doing that, we need to be much more live to the complexity of those issues. And you do also start to get into nerdy data technical questions. And when we were involved in doing the modelling on the schools for SAGE, one thing that struck me is that the focus on academic achievement, literacy and numeracy, was very intense. That's a great paper that was sent to me, by the way, fantastic paper. But actually what we missed, not in the report that we did, but not what we missed in terms of data, was recognition of all the ways in which schools contribute to people's well-being, life outcomes, interaction with others, the importance of adolescence, the importance of peers, the importance of the early years, how parents can't parent effectively when they parent alone, yeah? And what happens when parents lost that sort of network that they were part of to help them parent. The whole thing became, in a technical parlance, a shit show. And we're still seeing the effects in schools now. And it may not show up on achievement, but it's showing up in absence, it's showing up in mental health, it's showing up in many of the sort of challenges that demographers have identified, but we're not actually getting to the root causes of. And I think one of the things the centre can do is think very long and hard about what types of data you need to combine to go beyond painting a dismal picture of the future and actually start thinking about what are the drivers of all this, and can we start to develop policy that would act on those drivers in a really sort of constructive way. I mean, I'm a born optimist, and I think demographic science has huge potential to do good in the world. And I think the next phase of the centre, thinking about those levers, would be a really important contribution, as indeed I think we're doing already. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, because I think Anna actually has to get a train back to London any second now, maybe. So I don't know if we have time for any questions, but if not, we could ask them over lunch maybe, and I'll take this chance to thank the panellists and the presenters in session 1 Demography in Action. So thank you ever so much.